Delaware River Viaduct near Slateford, Pennsylvania. We're here on Christmas Eve 2016, which is the 105th anniversary, or birthday if you will, of the opening of the Lackawanna Cut-Off, which occurred on December 24th, 1911. Hi, I'm Chuck Walsh and I'm president of the North Jersey Rail Commuter Association, and this is the third in a series of installments and episodes on the Lackawanna Cut-Off. Previously we've been to the Haynesburg Viaduct, and also in our second installment we visited Port Morris and Lake Apacong Station. Now what we're going to do today is look not only at the viaduct, but we're going to visit Slateford Junction and then also the Delaware Water Gap, and we'll treat them as one unit, if you will. In fact, there's a very nice aerial photograph which shows the entire area and puts perspective of how they interconnected. Now, right now, I'm standing literally on the old road. This is the only operational part, with the exception of a small section in Washington, New Jersey, of the old road that is still in operation. The Lackawanna Cut-Off replaced the old road and superseded it in terms of importance of as far as the Lackawanna Railroad was concerned. Now, as we look at the viaduct, you can look across the river to New Jersey. You can see traffic on Route 80. Over here in Pennsylvania, there's about a mile and a half of track, or a mile and a half of right-of-way for the Lackawanna Cut-Off. Even though the Cut-Off, or the Lackawanna Cut-Off and New Jersey Cut-Off is named as such, there was a small section that actually was in Pennsylvania, and it's very important, as a matter of fact. So we're going to move on to underneath the Delaware River Viaduct, and we'll take a closer look. Here we are underneath the Delaware River Viaduct. The viaduct is 1,450 feet long from end to end and 65 feet tall. 65 feet, that is, from the top of the rail, or the train track, to the normal level of the Delaware River. In comparison, the Haynesburg Viaduct is 115 feet tall from rail to the river and 1,100 feet long. So while this particular viaduct is smaller in a sense than the Haynesburg Viaduct, it's about 350 feet longer. Now, the old road actually passes underneath the Cut-Off at this point, and of course the river passes underneath. The viaduct actually, when they built it, was intended to be a curved structure. If you look at old maps from 1906, the original structure was to have been on a 1.5-degree curve, which would have allowed for 75-mile-an-hour travel. Somewhere along the way in the engineering stages, the viaduct was changed to a straight structure with that 1.5-degree curve on the New Jersey side, and then a much sharper curve, a 3.5-degree curve on this side, which only had a 50-mile-an-hour speed limit, which has been, over the years, a little bit of an issue in terms of the operation of the line, because the Cut-Off from here to Slateford Junction, which is at this point just a little over a mile away, is an upward climb, and the sharpness of that curve to some degree might have enabled a train going eastbound up the hill to have to restrict its speed to 50 or 55 miles an hour. The speed limit actually has been changed over time depending on how they bank the curve during different time frames. So what we're going to do is now move on to Slateford Junction and talk about everything that is there and was there. Here we are at Slateford Junction in Slateford, Pennsylvania. Now, what you see here is not what you would expect if you had seen a historic photo of this same area. There was a lot here, not the least of which was a bridge upon which I'm standing right now, which is a fill. Is no longer a bridge, at least at this point it's not a bridge anymore. But behind me, Slateford Junction, there at one time was a total of 4 tracks on the cutoff, one of which led to a turntable, which was right here, right beneath when the bridge was here. And then 2 tracks, which as a matter of fact are still here, or I think one of them has been put back by the Delaware Lackawanna Railroad, which operates into here from Scranton. This is a meeting point for Norfolk Southern for freight operations here. Slateford Tower can't be seen at all. It's still there, but it's behind the trees. You can't see it, but it still exists. That's good news. Underneath here, as a matter of fact, when this bridge was taken out in 1990 by PennDOT, they actually didn't remove the tracks on the cutoff from underneath this. So there actually are tracks which are really the only original tracks from the cutoff which still exist on the line. The tracks, in fact, still stick out a little bit over here on the far edge of the fill. This is a famous spot in terms of the Lackawanna because so many shots have been taken here. And if you look around, there's the Delaware Water Gap, which is maybe about 2 miles from this location. There's a lot to talk about here and also at the Delaware Water Gap itself. The cutoff came underneath this, what was a bridge, as I mentioned at one time. The bridge was actually built such that it could accommodate a total of 6 tracks. There were never more than 4 tracks, but it could have accommodated as many as 6. Originally, this particular, I'll continue to call it a bridge, even though it's not anymore, at least not until it's replaced, was also where a trolley line ran through the water gap, and it ran over this bridge. And Route 611 actually did not exist until, I want to say sometime in the 1930s, when it was built. And there was a realignment of the old road, which is what basically this is over here to your right, to accommodate the new highway which was built through the water gap. So that pretty much is the Cliff Notes version of what Slateford Junction is. This is obviously the far end of the cutoff from Port Morris, which we looked at in a previous installment, where if you go to where the tower is, that would be roughly 28.5 miles from Port Morris Junction. And the actual, in later years, there was actually the cutoff actually went a little bit further, technically speaking, beyond the tower. There was actually what they called Slateford Switch, which is maybe a half a mile or so beyond the tower, and that was the official, if you will, end of the cutoff. In later years, if you look at photographs, you would see that there were 2 tracks on the cutoff here and only 1 on the old road, and then much later on in the Erie-Lackawanna years, there was only 1 track on the cutoff at this location and 1 over here. Ironically, now there are 2 here, and this is actually a yard that is used by Delaware Lackawanna to interchange cars with Norfolk Southern. So our next and last stop is going to be the Delaware Water Gap itself, and we'll talk a little bit about the history there, and we'll also get back to talking about that runaway I talked about in the previous installment. Here we are at Point of Gap in the Delaware Water Gap. This is, or was certainly, the scenic highlight of any trip along the Lackawanna Railroad. And this was a tourist destination for a number of years, by train, as a matter of fact. There were several large hotels that were located in this area within the Delaware Water Gap. Some actually located in the town of Water Gap, which is just up the road here. And also, well, suffice to say that this was a place that a lot of people like to visit. Now, we've talked about in the past the runaway of cement cars from Port Morris. This is actually a fairly sharp curve on the railroad. It's a 40-mile-an-hour curve. And if you look beyond me, somewhere in that direction is where those cars ended up when they went through here, 70, 75, 80. We don't really know exactly how fast they were going, but they were going fast enough that they just went straight into the river. There was also another accident which occurred here at this same location, same curve, and for essentially the same reason, and that was a passenger train that in, I believe, 1947 was trying to make up time in its westbound run from Hoboken, and came through here at in excess of 70 miles an hour, and the locomotive and the tender, there was a steam locomotive, ended up in the river. I think it also took one car with it, and then the rest of the train continued on for about a quarter mile or half a mile down the track before it stopped. Sadly, the engineer and firemen were killed in that accident. There's another interesting point of history that is associated here, which is not really very well known, and that is that the Lackawanna Cut-Off, or the New Jersey Cut-Off, which ended about 2 miles behind us, it was intended that there was going to be a second cut-off that would have either connected with the Lackawanna Cut-Off, the New Jersey Cut-Off, or would have started certainly very close to it. It would have come through here, would have actually created another tunnel going through this particular rock cropping of the water gap, and would have realigned the railroad between here and East Stroudsburg. For various reasons, it was never built. Perhaps because of cost, perhaps also because this was a scenic highlight. The last thing the railroad really wanted to do was to put the railroad in a tunnel at this location, even though it would have tremendously speeded up the trip. It's not clear whether the Lackawanna really was going to seriously go ahead with that particular project, but there are drawings which have been actually photographs taken by the Lackawanna photographer that show that there were several viaducts that were going to be on that line, and as I mentioned, there would have been at least this one particular tunnel, and it would have been a fast line. The speed limit would have been 80 miles an hour on that particular cutoff, but that was never built. So looking here, you can see that there's already ice that's forming on the river. If you look at shots, and there's one in particular from 1918 of Slateford, you'd see that ice is not an uncommon thing on the railroad here, or on ice on the river rather. And flooding has also been an issue over the years. And while Slateford Junction has remained above water, this particular area here is susceptible to flooding in extreme cases. I'm thinking of it was basically the 500 or 1,000-year flood of Hurricane Diane in 1955. So that's an overview of Slateford Junction, the Delaware Water Gap. We also looked at the Delaware River Viaduct. In a future episode, we will also go further into Pennsylvania, and we'll talk about rail service, because there's track here now. This is an operational piece of railroad, and this would be used by New Jersey Transit for future rail service into northeastern Pennsylvania. It has not been determined exactly what would be the next stop. Probably they would stop in Water Gap, East Stroudsburg, and maybe beyond at that point. Ultimately getting to Scranton, but that at this point is up in the air in terms of what would be the next phase in terms of expanding the service beyond Andover, which I've mentioned in previous installments is currently under construction. So thank you for listening, and certainly hope you look forward to our next installment on the Lackawanna Cut-Off.